Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the At the Water's Edge podcast, where we look for insights beyond the headlines to take a practitioner's view on national security and geopolitics. It's the 10th of March, 2026. Let's get started. Now, today we're sitting down and talking with Samuel Bendett from the Center of Naval Analysis, where he focuses on Russian military technology, the evolution of unmanned systems, and the changing character of war. Now, one of his most unique insights is how civil society has actually changed and evolved and adapt to support warfighting efforts in situations where you have larger, more technologically superior enemies going after smaller, weaker states. Now, he's looking at this in the context of Ukraine versus Russia, but you can draw some pretty tight parallels to what he's observed and what we see going on in the Middle East right now with the current war between U.S. and Israel and Iran. Interesting stuff. With that, we'll have a quick word from our friends at the Work to Find Podcast Network and into our context with Sam. So excited he took the time to share his insights with us. He is a wealth of knowledge in this area.
Hi, I'm Stephen Rothberg.
And I'm Jeanette Leeds.
And together, we're the co-hosts of the High Volume Hiring Podcast.
Are you involved in hiring dozens or even hundreds of employees a year? If so, you know that the typical sourcing tools, tactics, and strategies, they just don't scale.
Yeah. Our bi-weekly podcast features news, tips, case studies, and interviews with the world's leading experts about the good, the bad, and the ugly when it comes to high-volume hiring.
Make sure to subscribe today.
All right. Well, good afternoon and welcome to the podcast. How are you doing today, sir?
I'm doing great. How about yourself?
Wonderful. Enjoying another snowy day up here in Syracuse. It's great.
I'm sorry to hear that.
Yeah. Anyway, gotta love the Great White North. So for folks who aren't familiar with your work, can you introduce yourself in your own words to the audience?
So I work for Center for Naval Analyses. We are a federally funded research and development center. For those of you who don't know what CNA is, you actually do know what CNA is, because if you watch the original Top Gun, the character of Charlie is actually based on a real live CNA researcher, Dr. Christine Fox, who deployed with the Top Gun program in the middle of the Cold War to analyze Soviet tactics and to teach the Top Gun program. Now, minus all the sordid sex and romance, she did an enormous amount of work, and it was incredibly useful to the Top Gun. I think when the movie was made, CNA was asked if they want a byline in the movie, but because it is a DoD-funded or Department of Defense-funded program, rather institution, they said no at that time. But here we are. So now you know CNA. And my work at CNA is looking at the Russian development of weapons, tactics, and systems, how and why Russia fights. And since the first day of the Ukraine invasion in 2022, I've been keeping an eye on Russian development of tactics, techniques, procedures, concepts, and certain types of weapons.
Nice. Now, a lot of things have changed with warfare since Ukraine popped off in 2022. What assumptions did the Western defense establishment have about Russia's capabilities and how they would fight a war prior to 2022, and how well have those assumptions held up since?
Well, a lot of assumptions about Russian ability to fight back then were based on Russia's more defensive posture, because prior to 2022, Russian military training, their military drills and exercises were geared towards defending their homeland against a large and technologically advanced adversary. So when they had to deploy in large numbers against what was seemed at the time a much smaller military, there was an assumption that all that preparation would essentially push to an outcome where maybe Russian demands would be met halfway or thereabouts. In other words, no one anticipated that Ukrainian would be able to resist to such an extent. No one anticipated that Russia would not be able to accomplish its objectives. And the initial Russian invasion of Ukraine was rather limited in scope and was conducted by a relatively small Russian military when compared to the size of Ukraine as territory and the size of the goal that Russia had for itself. And so those assumptions about Russian ability to fight and Russian preparation were very concerning to the West, were very concerning to United States observers. Again, no one really anticipated how Ukrainian military would perform. once it became clear that Ukraine is not only capable of defending itself, but actually pushing Russians out and actually defeating them in multiple engagements, including those around Kiev and also in the south, it became clear that a lot of assumptions about Russian military capability were faulty to the extent that we simply did not know how a military like Russia would fight a prolonged war. And so we didn't necessarily factor that into our understanding of how Ukrainian conflict would evolve. Everything that Russia practiced and all of their drills and exercises were not geared towards a years-long conflict. So we worked with what we had, and we had the information that we essentially had. We did not have a lot of information about Ukrainian capabilities because a lot of American and Western analysts were paying attention to Russia as a potential adversary. So not enough information and data was collected about Ukraine, which is something that has definitely been corrected since then.
Yeah. I'm curious. I mean, the impact that drones have had on the way this conflict has played out has been tremendous. And I'm wondering what assumptions we could have even had about, Ukrainian capabilities to defend, because the drone technology that we've seen evolve, maybe it was present, but it wasn't understood how it could be employed, at least in Western military circles. Everyone's idea of drone warfare, and I still see this a lot, it's like, oh, we're just going to make more MQ-9s and throw them out there. How has the proliferation of small drones really changed the way that the Ukrainian war has been fought?
Well, you're absolutely right, and your question feeds into our into the first question that you asked, and that is our assumptions about war, our assumptions about the length of conflict, and our assumptions about the capabilities of both adversaries. So yes, prior to 2022, when you discussed military drones, you were talking about expensive, large systems fielded by a very small number of countries, including, of course, the United States, but also Russia as well. I think Russia went into Ukraine with a UAV fleet around 2,000 UAV units in total. This is the number that they publicly discussed, and this is the number that they publicly quoted. And so once the war became this attritional stationary conflict in 2022, 23, 24, both sides were essentially running through their available stocks very, very quickly. And there was a necessity to field a greater number of UAVs that were constantly lost to adversary fires, adversary countermeasures, including electronic warfare, to pilot error, and any other number of reasons. But the sheer number of UAVs, which are flying right now in this conflict, we're in the 5th year of this war, essentially means that in the gray zone, that is 0 to about 10 or 20 kilometers from the line of contact in each direction, the sheer number of UAV units available, rather UAV numbers in that space, means that it is fairly transparent. And no amount of soldiers or forces or technologies or systems fielded in that particular area is going to escape the eye of the drone flying at different altitudes. And that is why a lot of heavier, more expensive systems were pushed back from the line of contact. And those that operate within this gray zone have to either be extremely mobile or rather expendable or move in and out of that gray zone very, very quickly. At the same time, both sides are also fielding tens of thousands of tactical UAVs every month. And so along with ISR UAVs, along with UAVs that act as relays, as signal communication systems, as logistics and supply platforms, there's essentially nowhere for any soldier to escape once that soldier is in the gray zone. And so if you were sighted by a UAV, by an adversary drone, chances are you'd be attacked not by one, but by multiple drones at once. And so, again, the sheer numbers of these drones built in the millions every year indicates that such systems are available at the very tactical level, so that the smallest UAV crew, a smallest UAV formation, can field a number of these drones in quick succession. Prior to 2022, when we talked about availability of tactical drones, we usually talked at the company or battalion formation, fielding maybe one or just a few ISR drones. Now, squads and even individual soldiers can possess UAVs at the tactical edge. And that changes how both sides fight at the tactical edge, how they defend themselves, how they conduct reconnaissance, how they conduct attacks, and any number of other military missions.
And the proliferation of these drones, it seems like this wasn't like a deliberate choice by Russia to get a bunch of small UAVs at the front line, or a deliberate choice by Ukraine to counter Russian aggression. But both sides just seemed like they just ran out of stuff and they had nothing left to fight with. They grabbed these small drones and then they've learned and adapt since then. Is that correct? Is this like just a natural evolution of the conflict that we've now found ourselves in this spot? Or was there deliberate planning behind this proliferation of small UAVs?
Well, a little bit of both. Again, no one really knew how a very large military would fight for a prolonged period of time in conditions that Russia encountered in Ukraine. We also did not know or anticipate how Ukrainian military would conduct itself in a prolonged conflict against a military like Russia. And again, I want to reiterate that a lot of military analysis in that former Soviet space was directed at Russia as a potential adversary. And not enough attention was paid to the Ukrainian capabilities. And so both sides ran out of basic supplies very, very quickly once it became clear that they would have to fight for weeks, for months, and now years. And now what we have witnessed since then is a very interesting co-evolution of both military capabilities by both countries, but also the evolution of civil society assistance to both belligerents, as Ukrainian civil society and Russian civil society have mobilized to help and assist the soldiers with acquiring the very basics, things that no one could anticipate they need, or things that soldiers spent very, very quickly. And both militaries essentially allowed this type of assistance to continue. At the more operational, strategic levels, military enterprises and both countries' ministries of defense spent a lot of resources developing military-grade drones. But in the initial phases of the conflict, a lot of tactical intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance capabilities were actually provided by commercial UAV platforms, because both sides rushed to acquire DJI Mavic drone, a very simple quadcopter that is essentially a perfect solution out of the box, something that's easy to fly, easy to operate, has excellent cameras, and is easy to maintain. At the same time, civil societies on both sides started assembling other tactical drones needed by both militaries, and this is how FPV drones essentially entered the battle initially as this sort of do-it-yourself DIY creation built out of commercial components sourced from China in very large quantities. And so now the vast preponderance of tactical drones are still built by the militaries, both at the operational and tactical levels, but also civil society still assists their respective militaries with acquisition of certain assets like DJI Mavic drones, tactical drone detectors, maybe antennas, and others sourced from commercial components. And so this conflict is unique not just in how it is fought, not just in its attritional nature that persists into 2026, but also in how commercial components can coexist and co-evolve with military-grade components, something that we absolutely could not anticipate prior to the start of this invasion. To give an example, yes, everybody knew about FPV drones. They were racing toys. Everybody knew about DJI Mavic drones as commercial elements. Obviously, commercial drones used by belligerents was not necessarily new, because some non-state actors in the Middle East and Africa were experimenting with commercial UAVs and grenade drops from DJI Mavics. But no one could foresee how all of those UAVs, all of those technologies would be scaled up to such a significant extent in Ukraine. And so while we knew of some of those threats presented by tactical commercial drones, while we knew of the existence of certain technologies, we certainly could not anticipate how those technologies would impact the war that now lasts for years.
So what you said there is very interesting about the role of civil society. And we've definitely seen a lot of reporting about it in Western media from the Ukrainian standpoint, them scrapping together everything they can, sending it to the front line. As a smaller nation, that makes a lot of sense. But it's interesting to hear about that happening in Russia to support their military. I'm curious, like, how does civil society in Russia even know what troops on the front line need? And, how the heck does the Putin regime allow that support to happen? Because it seems like it's undercutting their own legitimacy to start this war with Ukraine and then have this volunteer effort to keep it going. I'm actually surprised to hear that that's going on inside Russia with Putin in charge.
We can actually do a separate podcast just on that. In fact, I've spoken about it repeatedly. I have presented about this concept in both domestic and international settings. What you're describing basically has a official moniker of People's VPK. VPK is a Russian acronym for the military-industrial complex. And so People's VPK was officially labeled in 2024, but it was really born in 2022. And it's a very unusual chapter in Russian history insofar as any official military assistance to the Russian forces or any type of development of weapons, no matter how small, was always the monopoly of the state, beginning with the birth of the Russian state in the early 17th century. So the state always oversaw and controlled how weapons are developed and how they're shipped to the front and who gets them. In this particular war, what we have seen is a very interesting convergence of both the availability of commercial components that could potentially be used for war and the unprecedented open communication about some of the gaps and capabilities in this conflict on both sides, but especially on the Russian side. Because again, Russian soldiers went to the front with their own cell phones, right? The biggest common denominator for any 19-year-old soldier around the world right now is that he or she is going to have their own mobile device close by, and likely would have internet or Wi-Fi close by, and likely would have access to lots of apps on which to post stuff. And this is how we fast forward to 2026, end up with absolutely staggering amount of video, imagery, and other data coming from the battlefield. But it became very quickly apparent to the military itself, to the soldiers, that they don't have a lot of things. And as the Russian military ramped up its force structure and as it needed hundreds of thousands of troops in 2022 and 2023, it could basically mobilize the bodies, but the system wasn't necessarily catching up to the needs and demands for supplying logistics for these additional hundreds of thousands of troops. And as the conflict became attritional and very stationary in nature in 22 and 23 and also in 24, the soldiers essentially could be on their front lines for prolonged periods of time while having access to their commercial technologies like their mobile cell phones. So very quickly, these soldiers, these officers wrote back to their relatives and friends and said, hey, we need sleeping bags, we need boots, we need medical kits, we need masking nets, we need all kinds of stuff. We need Baofeng radios, a Chinese-made tactical radio, which wasn't available, which as a tactical radio wasn't really available in the Russian forces in large numbers. So Russians started asking for the Baofeng radios and other radios that people could commercially, or rather get on commercial marketplaces very quickly. And since we're talking about weapons and systems, and as we already mentioned, drones, a lot of people started asking, can you buy us a DJI Mavic drone so we can use it in tactical engagements, so we can see what's going on a couple of clicks out, so we can see around the forest belt, so we can see around the corner in this village where we are stuck. And the role of the government and the military is quite interesting in this because they initially allowed the flow of this commercial technology to the front. This is how certain volunteer groups were born. This is how people banded together in an ad hoc fashion to essentially create technical workshops in their garage, on their balcony, in their home, where they could modify certain commercial products and send to the front with the friends and relatives who sometimes traveled to see frontline troops. And because I mentioned cell phones, people took the Telegram messaging platform. They took to Signal, and they started communicating openly about their needs and capabilities. And they still do that. You can still go on Telegram and certain Telegram channels and see how soldiers are asking for DJI Mavics for certain units and for certain formations. And they supply a bank card where anybody can donate money that would then be used to purchase a DJI Mavic drone. And then these soldiers will make a video thanking those who donated with that DJI Mavic drone, basically in the camera shot.
So this is war by GoFundMe.
So yes, to a certain
Wow.
extent. Obviously,
Okay.
the defense industrial complex in both countries has a monopoly on weapons creation and development, on the numbers of weapons that were fielded, on the types of weapons that were fielded. But certain types of systems became quite important at the tactical level, and they were absolutely of commercial origin. And so this led one of the Russian retired generals in 2022 to announce that DJI Mavic quadcopter has elevated artillery to the level of precision not seen since World War I. And DJI Mavic quadcopter is essentially a new face of warfare. Fast forward to February 2026,
Wow.
we're still using DJI Mavic quadcopters, and soldiers are still asking for them for the front line. And so both sides, and especially Russia, they were civil society, there still are civil society organizations and volunteer efforts that try to fundraise for the military needs. Now, you've mentioned something very important, and how does the Russian state allow this to happen? Whenever there is a number of money involved or significant fundraising is involved, whenever there's a successful story in Russia, right, especially in technology development, the state usually gets involved. And so over time, the Russian state and the Russian military began co-opting a lot of these volunteer technical startup efforts, sometimes nicely, sometimes not so nicely. And right now, the People's VPK still plays a role, but a much, much smaller role in how the Russian military is supplied with certain systems, technologies, and logistics. It is a lot more VPK and a lot less people's now. If we look at what is happening in 2026 and compare it with what was happening in 2022, but people still take the telegram. Russian soldiers, volunteers still take the telegram, and they talk about the needs and the capabilities and the gaps, and they still try to fundraise. And this brings me to the final point, and that is this war has played out in a fairly open fashion on Telegram, on Signal, on Twitter. And this has caused significant concern in the Russian government and the military, to the extent that they now want people to get off the Telegram, not openly discuss the war, not essentially air this war out for the world to see. And they want to push Russians to use a state-developed messaging app, which would not be available globally, which would only be available in Russia and a number of countries, and would obviously be under the control and oversight of the state. And so as the war played out on Telegram and continues to do so, it aided these messaging apps, this availability of commercial technology aided in the supply of certain systems and technologies to the front, and also in the development of these technologies. So DJI Mavic is still used. A lot of FPV drones that we see in combat are still made with a lot of commercial components. And in 2023 and 2024, a lot of FPVs that were flying, for example, were sourced from commercial components, sourced entirely from China. That is happening a lot less now, as the state in both countries has basically assumed more and greater control of weapons development and shipment and acquisition. But the civil society is still active. Civil society is still very much prevalent on both sides of the conflict. And Ukrainian military and government were able to establish a good relationship with its civil society, with its technical startups. Russia is trying to do the same. It is trying to replicate some of the Ukrainian successes, but it's a slow going because Russia ultimately is a much more authoritarian, vertical, top-down country than Ukraine is right now. And the state and the military ultimately want to have control of what is happening. And that is why there's a lot of sort of efforts to rein in this People's VPK. At the same time, the president and the defense minister of Russia have recognized the contributions of this People's VPK and have stated openly that they want to create mechanisms to facilitate this rapid innovation and enable these technical startups to coexist with large industrial enterprises. Whether that's actually going to happen after the war is highly doubtful.
So this brings up a really interesting question about what lessons America needs to be learning here, because our approach to tactical radios, everything's secure. We have frequency hopping. You're not allowed to bring personal cell phones anywhere. Nobody follows those rules at all. Even in Afghanistan in 2020, we were running around with personal devices running on Sapphire pucks that we bought ourselves, and that was part of our pace plan, and we were streaming drone feeds over WhatsApp to partner forces because that's all they had. It seems like in Ukraine that this proliferation of commercial communications technology is just exploding, just like small drones are. What does America need to learn about its approach to OPSEC and how it's going to run its own operations? Because it sounds like if we got into a big fight with a big power, we would burn through all our high end stuff pretty quick, the same way Ukraine and Russia did, just on a larger scale. And then, yeah, we'd be grabbing whatever we can off the shelves. Oh, by the way, we don't make most of that stuff here anymore. But just what does our military need to learn about how it approaches its own, what they call OPSEC, from this conflict? Because this doesn't seem like something anyone wants to tackle.
Well, I think it has been tackled, honestly. I think Army and Marine Corps are trying to understand this very concept, this very dilemma. Obviously, we're used to fighting with larger, more exquisite and expensive systems. We're used to dominate the battle space and the airspace with fewer units to begin with. In a conflict with China, that's probably not going to be the case. I would say this: the biggest lesson right now that the U.S. military is learning from Ukraine combat, from both belligerents, is the need and the ability for soldiers to modify their technology as they see fit. So if they get a very capable but expensive UAV, right now they can't really do anything with it. So either they fly it as is, or they lose it in combat and it has to be replaced in a fairly expensive fashion. But right now, on both sides of the conflict, in field laboratories dug inside the trenches, soldiers are modifying and tinkering with existing technology. For example, Ukrainians always say that when they get a UGV, unmanned ground vehicle, from a developer, they spend some time modifying it for frontline combat. Because no matter how well informed the developer is about soldiers' needs, it is soldiers themselves who know exactly what to do with it. And so they often modify, for example, some UGV variants to the extent that it looks completely different than the original model supplied. This is happening on the Russian side as well. This is true with UAVs. This is true with certain sensor technologies, antennas, and other equipment. So the ability of American soldiers to modify what they need at the tactical edge and use it as they see fit is very, very important. And this obviously necessitates and requires a different approach by American technology developers and suppliers for the larger U.S. military.
Yeah, it sounds like we do need to have a whole separate conversation about the role of civil society in these fights, because right now I'm thinking we need to start bringing back shop class to all these high schools.
Well, Russians are actually bringing the technology education back to the middle schools and high schools. They are trying to make sure that all students, by the time they graduate high school, know about UAVs, are familiar with UAVs, and know how to fly them. And so this is a nationwide program to educate as many young kids as possible in the basics of modern conflict as we see it right now. It isn't yet a nationwide program, but it is spreading far and wide. The same goes for teachers, for example, in some parts of Russia, who are also going through certain types of education when it comes to either UAVs or sometimes even AI, so that they can teach that to the students. So that is one way, for example, to approach long-term education of the potential force and long-term familiarity of this force from an early age with technologies that may or may not become prevalent by the time they're adults and can join the military.
Right. So drones have obviously been a huge source of innovation in this conflict. How have we seen AI start coming to play? Is AI actually being used in any sort of meaningful way on the battlefield, either by Russia or Ukraine?
Yes. We probably don't know the full extent of how AI is used by both sides, simply because of its obviously classified military nature. But Ukrainians and Russians have been on the record that they are using elements of AI for data analysis. All of the videos made by millions of drones, all of the footage made by soldiers, satellite imagery, and other related content about this war is generating absolutely massive quantities of data. And so you want to be, as a soldier, as a warfighter, you want to be as precise as possible in identifying adversary targets, adversary locations. so that either soldiers or drones or other technologies can take them out. And so Ukraine announced recently that it is using AI to train or for training by using massive data sets that would enable AI to quickly pinpoint and identify adversary location for adversary weapons, tactics, and systems. Russians are likely doing the same because prior to 2022, as early as 2018, they said that they want to use AI for data analysis and decision making, and it is likely that they're either using commercial products or indigenous AI programs and algorithms to sift through absolutely massive quantities of data. One specific data point that is public is that in late 2024, Ukraine announced that it has collected something like 2 centuries worth of data from Ukraine combat, from all the elements which are used in Ukraine, especially UAVs. And so they are now starting to train their AI algorithms on that data, because obviously what does AI need? AI needs data for training, right? And the more data you have, the better your AI, the more accurate your AI is going to be. And so both sides by now have collected absolutely staggering quantities of data that they are now using for AI training and for identifying adversarial data points. Another method in which AI is used is limited application in target acquisition and target lock technologies, where a drone can lock onto what looks like a target, get final approval from the operator, and then fly to that target on its own without the connection to the operator. This, of course, allows the drone to bypass electronic warfare, for example. Other elements of artificial intelligence are related in their uses in this war, but likely not discussed openly. We know that Ukraine is partnering up with NATO and United States on artificial intelligence development and testing. We know there are Western companies cooperating with Ukraine in developing advanced weapons with artificial intelligence, and Russians are likely doing the same. It is likely that they're sharing some of that data with China, for example, because China and Russia have an official military-to-military cooperation. It may even be that Russia is sharing its some of its AI tools and advanced mechanisms with North Korea as well, because North Korean troops are also fighting in Ukraine on behalf of Russia. It is likely that Russia can get access to and assistance from Iran in certain types of UAV developments, and may even be sharing its AI-enabled data with Iranians as well. So AI is on the front lines to a certain extent. It isn't yet powering fully autonomous weapons and systems. And sometimes soldiers actually are mistrustful of weapons and drones, especially that have a claim that they can operate on their own and identify targets on their own. There's still that cultural and psychological distrust of some of these more advanced technologies, because only humans have a truly intuitive sense to see something and understand what it is. Even if it's a very well camouflaged and masked tank or a location, we as humans would know what that is. AI often does not, and still needs some time to train to understand what it sees.
What adaptations do we need to start making to prepare our own ground formations to survive in a space like Ukraine? Because, the Army's moving, from the brigade to the division as a unit of action. They're trying to get small drones down in all sorts of places. They're struggling to get commercial communications technology into the force. They've been struggling with that for years. They frankly don't seem like they're making very rapid progress. I'm just imagining, if we rolled the 10th Mountain Division or 3rd ID into Ukraine right now, I don't think they'd be there for very long. And I'm trying to figure out what steps would we need to take to prepare those formations, either a restructuring or just giving them new supplies or, different education for soldiers. Like, what are the key things that we need to start getting right quick so that if we find ourselves in this situation, we don't learn the lessons after 10,000 body bags are filled?
Well, it's going to take a technological change, a doctrinal change, a policy change, and a psychological change. I think the last one is probably very important because until recently, United States military wasn't really used to not controlling the battle space. U.S. soldiers were not trained to look up and try to interdict threats which fly only a couple of hundred to just several thousand feet above them, right? And that's the That's the kill box in Ukraine, where the kill zone is filled with all kinds of tactical drones and other systems that quickly identify and strike targets. There was a recent exercise, a NATO exercise, that it was called, I believe, Hedgehog, where a NATO force rolled out into battle the way it usually fights. And the adversaries were actually Ukrainian units. And a very small Ukrainian unit was able to demolish a full brigade-sized formation because those soldiers, those weapons and systems and commanders rolled out still as if it was early 2022 and not early 2026. So they didn't factor in how UAVs could patrol the skies, how they could identify targets. They didn't necessarily factor in exactly how to counter tactical drones. They couldn't identify Ukrainian UAV teams and UAVs in the air. And of course, they lost. And so this is a public record. You can read about it. And I think it's a harbinger of not necessarily things to come because NATO and United States are learning, but it's a good lesson for those who still think that the war in Ukraine is something highly unique and will not impact future wars because future wars may be different, fought in different climates, in different terrains, and in different domains. But we know that United States military is learning right now. We know that U.S. Marine Corps is learning right now. And the number one lesson right now they're learning is what's it like to operate in a battle space at the tactical edge if there are lots and lots of tactical assets available to the adversary that can identify a friendly force and then strike it. And so UAS and counter-UAS training is now part of the of trainings and drills conducted by the military, U.S. military, again, Army and the Marine Corps. And the second lesson they're learning is how to counter these threats and how to scale up both the defense and offense from the tactical to operational, from operational to strategic edge.
So it seems like there's almost two buckets of lessons here. One's, how does a macro fight between two large nation states play out? High levels of attrition, transition from military technology to reliance on commercially available technology adapted for military use, rapid adaptation at the small unit level. And then there's the micro lessons of just the new tactics, techniques, procedures for dealing with this environment that just has ubiquitous drone coverage and drones doing all sorts of new things. But what lessons do you think our other main geopolitical rivals are learning from Ukraine? What's China taking from this? What's Iran taking from this? And one thing about top-down authoritarian regimes is that they can be slower to find the right solution, but they can be a lot quicker to adapt it. And so I'm wondering what our main rivals out there in the world, what they're taking from this conflict, and if they're somehow adapting to this faster than we are.
We can do separate podcasts just on what China is learning or what Iran is learning or what North Korea is learning. And there's lots of people way smarter than me that study those particular countries. We know from public videos, for example, of Chinese military drills, that they are incorporating tactical and operational level UAVs in their formal training, as well as a number of UGV and other related technologies. For example, China, Iran, and now North Korea all have the Shahed-like drone, which they're probably building in very large numbers. Other belligerents like North Korea are building Lancet-like loading munitions that they likely picked up from Russia or had Russia basically transfer that technology to them. There's a lot of note-taking right now from, or rather with Chinese and Iranian and North Korean militaries as they see how Russian soldiers are fighting, how Ukrainian soldiers are fighting. North Koreans are learning basically on the fly, no pun intended, as they are training to use tactical systems and how to defend against tactical systems. And they're taking that experience back to their military, just like China is taking that experience back to its military. Russia has official military-to-military cooperation with China, Iran, North Korea, and a number of other countries. And obviously part of that official cooperation involves sharing lessons learned from the longest conflict Europe has ever witnessed since World War II. So they are learning how to utilize tactical systems, how to counter these tactical systems. They're learning on Russian mistakes. Obviously, after Operation Spiderweb has demolished a portion of Russian strategic aviation, it is highly likely that countries like China and Iran and North Korea, which are normally paranoid about their military assets, have started paying serious attention how to protect certain military assets against potential strikes like Operation Spiderweb. So there's a lot of learning happening right now. Not all of it is obviously public. What is public tells us that these countries are paying very, very, very close attention to the war in Ukraine.
Well, we're coming up on time, but what is it about this conflict do you think is most misunderstood by the American public? And what do you think they should be aware of when they're looking at what's going on in the world and what's next for them?
I think probably the most misunderstood aspects of this war, and not just by the public, but also by policymakers, is that any conflict can get out of control, and any predictions you have about how you will fight, how your adversary will fight, will very quickly go out the window. I'm going to paraphrase the great Mike Tyson, who said that everyone has a plan until we get punched in the face. And so we can plan, our adversaries can plan, but we don't always know, and we cannot always predict how the conflict would evolve. So it's very unlikely that many policymakers or even intelligence officials in the United States were predicting that the war in Ukraine would last this long. And so there's a lot we don't know. There's a lot that we can't factor in. When I'm asked sometimes to talk about weapons development for the next decade or decade and a half and kind of see beyond the horizon, I always back out saying, look, 5 years ago, we didn't know what an FPD was in military context, right? And we could not actually predict how fiber optic controlled systems are going to be impactful in the war in Ukraine. We could not predict many other technological and doctrinal facets, which are now impacting how both sides are fighting in Ukraine. So this is something that we need to keep in mind. That there's a lot we don't know, and there's absolutely a lot we cannot predict.
Well said. Well, Sam, thank you so much for hopping on and sharing your insights with us today. Really appreciate the conversation, and good luck to you out there.
Thank you.
All right.